I am George Scott Romney. I am a partner at Honigman, Miller, Schwartz & Cohn, a law firm in Detroit. Well, I grew up in Detroit. I was born in Detroit. We lived in the Palmer Woods until I was about 11 or 12, and then we moved to Bloomfield Hills. I don't know what it was like because to me it was normal, but because my parents spent a lot of time with us and they were wonderful parents. So growing up was not an unusual experience for me. I didn't really know, my dad really became more well known when he became president of American Motors, and a couple of years made it on Time magazine and some other honors, and so that gave some prominence and some interest to some people. Well, he taught us that my father was truly an advocate for civil rights and was an advocate for treating people fairly and properly, and he developed this himself. I think his family, of course, were members of the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We were the church. His ancestors were driven out of Missouri. There was an edict by the governor asking for all Mormons to be killed on sight, and was only revoked in the last few years. So that was quite dramatic. So he saw a lot of discrimination there. He was born in Mexico, although his parents were U.S. citizens, and was driven out when he was 4, and his father lost everything. So he saw a lot of discrimination against him because of his religious beliefs and because of being an American when he was a kid. So his father taught him to treat everybody equally, and it was very important. It just was something that was inbred in him, and he inbred it into us. He just taught us always that we were to treat people equally. And if you read some of his papers, which are at the University of Michigan, you'll find some of the letters he sent to his father talking about dealing with people in Michigan of color and otherwise, and how important it was to treat everybody properly, and how wonderful so many people were with whom he dealt. Well, did he feel it? Well, I don't think he felt a responsibility himself. He was, as a matter of fact, when he was governor, we adopted a new constitution, and he's formed Citizens for Michigan with Walter Reuther and Ed McNamara, who was not Ed McNamara, Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense and formerly head of Ford Motor Company, and they helped establish the idea of a new constitution. And our constitution was the first constitution in the United States that included a Civil Rights Commission, and that constitution was adopted in 1963. So he had already spent a lot of time trying to develop and improve race relations, and it was a major commitment on his part. And in fact, the vote that he received from the Detroit area, which is as best as you could tell was, and other areas, and best that you could define it at the time as an African-American vote, doubled each time that he ran. He ran 3 times. So he felt that things were getting better, and I think they were getting better, but the riot inflamed what was occurring at the time. When I describe the riot as a race riot, I think largely it was a race riot. It was largely African Americans who were causing the disturbances, and I don't know what. Obviously, there was discrimination. There's no question there was discrimination. There still is some discrimination in our country, an attitude of people. The laws had become better, but that didn't mean that it was perfect. There was actually much advancement in terms of what had occurred even at that time. But many people felt disenfranchised, and the police conduct sparked, and a blind pig sparked the riots. I don't think, even though there was discrimination and the police, I'm certain, and I don't know all the things that happened there specifically, probably didn't act appropriately. It didn't excuse what so many people did at that time. It didn't excuse the conduct of creating a riot. And really, it destroyed so many properties of African Americans more than anybody else. It hurt their own community more than any other people. During the riots, I was able to go with my dad to a number of things. We toured with the state police over and saw areas where people were actually rioting and looting, and saw stuff in the street and danger around. And then I toured with my dad with Cyrus Vance, who was sent here by President Johnson to investigate the area, and toured with them again in other areas of the city. I spent a night with my dad in a hospital room. I forget which hospital it was, maybe receiving. We spent the night in that hospital sleeping, and then got up the next morning. And one of the profound things that may not be interesting to you in terms of this, but one of the profound things about that whole experience was that my father was, at the time, considered to be a potential presidential candidate, and Lyndon Johnson, of course, was concerned about that. Lyndon Johnson was the president, and so my father asked for help from the federal troops, from the National Guard, to help quell the disturbance. And he put it in writing, and Cyrus Vance came back to him and said, well, that wasn't sufficient, you need to say this. And so then he would put it in writing a few hours later and put that in it, and Cyrus Vance would come back and say, that wasn't sufficient, now you need to add this. It happened 3 times over maybe a 36-hour period before they finally agreed to send the National Guard here. And I think that was partially a political event. Now, the Detroit riot, of course, as you probably know, and I don't know the particulars of all the others, but there were several other riots that this sparked and became a spark for in other places in the country. Obviously, people upset about the treatment of themselves, feeling that they were not being treated properly, and wanted to vent their disappointment in a way that really created a lot of havoc. It's kind of interesting because, you said, should my father take blame? It's also interesting that the Lyndon Johnson had been and was a major proponent of civil rights, and the 1964 Voting Rights Act was adopted before '67. So and then, as I said, we had a Civil Rights Commission in this state, the first one in the country, and so there were actually things going on to improve race relations more significantly that occurred in many, many years, and yet these disturbances occurred. What I observed in my father, I think the main thing that I observed in my father was his concern. He was really concerned about what was happening to people. He was very upset, obviously, of the destruction, and then also the people that weren't involved, the byproducts of it. People were raising the price of milk and bread to exorbitant levels to take advantage of the lack of supply and try to take advantage of the lack of being able to provide easy transport. He was very concerned about that. He was very concerned about what to do about solving the problem. And as you may know, that he and the mayor, of course, was Jerome Kavanaugh at the time. Mayor Kavanaugh, who was also a proponent of civil rights, and my dad and Mayor Kavanaugh and Joe Hudson, after the riot, decided to form an organization of top business leaders and top community leaders called New Detroit, which still exists and in which I'm still involved, to try to improve race relations immediately thereafter and subsequently. Their mission statement was to improve race relations, to discuss in a non-threatening way the issues between blacks and whites, and try to understand what could be done to improve things. At that time, and today a significant concern is the education, because the education in Detroit is a serious, serious problem. And I could talk about that for quite some time because it's not been handled well, I don't think. But at that time, the education was probably in pretty good shape. In the 50s, we were one of the top cities in education in the country, and I don't think it had deteriorated by the time of the riots. It was still a pretty high quality education in the city. But to talk about educational opportunity, economic opportunity, and basically just fair treatment in terms of housing and opportunities across the board. That was the purpose of New Detroit. Did I notice any changes as a result of the Detroit riot? I think there was an interest of everyone to try to avoid violence in the future. I think that the leaders of the African American community and the community organizations and the business leaders, particularly at the time, wanted to make certain that something like that didn't happen again, wanted to have a better understanding of what the grievances were that people had and so forth. But there's been a huge amount of progress since then in terms of race relations. It doesn't mean that it's perfect now, but there was a huge amount of progress that occurred, and much of the problems today are as a result of some of the people particularly in the Detroit area, that are of color, that are also in poverty and in situations where it's not a good working environment or family life. So those things have been, and basically family life in our whole country has deteriorated. So there's been some deterioration in terms of people having good family relations and good parents to help their children and parent their children. That's gotten worse in both the white and the African American community. More dramatically in the African American community, the difference in poverty may even be in some ways worse. And I think the attitude is more difficult today, even though opportunities are probably better than what they were. They're still not right, but the attitude of people is pretty significantly different. Well, I would have been 26. I graduated from college, and then I served a mission for my church for a couple of years, and I was a student at Harvard Law School, and I was back for the summer. I could just see a couple scenes. I could still see them. I could still see somebody running out of a store and throwing a rock somewhere, and then debris in the street, and people milling around, and then the driver saying, "We need to leave this. This may not be a safe area to stay in," because. I forgot what position Cyrus Vance had. What was it? What was his position? Do you know at the time? But anyway, he was the representative of the president, and he wanted to tour it and see everything. And of course, my dad did earlier. So it was. So I could still see some of those scenes in my mind's eye. Oh yes, that was prior to the National Guard. Oh yeah, that was poor. That was before, because Cyrus Vance was trying, and my dad too, to evaluate what needed to be done to try to bring order. Because when it blew up, at first it was Mayor Kavanaugh that was trying to solve it, and that went on for a night or a day or however long. And then he asked for help from the governor, and my dad immediately came and got involved. But then he wanted immediately to have the National Guard, and that's why Cyrus Vance came to town. And then he created the delay in terms of doing it. I have always thought, and I can't document it, but I've always thought, and we always believed at the time, that it was purely political on President Johnson's part. He wanted to make it look like the governor could not solve his problem, the governor of Michigan, because this was his problem. Of course, it's the country's problem. It was everybody's problem. It wasn't caused by the people of Michigan. It happened across the country too. So, and they're obviously the president and the governor had already done things to try to improve race relations in this country. But the president wanted to make the governor that might be his opponent look as bad as possible. Of course, neither one of them ended up being the candidates in '68. And of course, we had the Vietnam War going on at the same time, which may not, people have dismissed that a lot, but it created a lot of people. There were a lot of demonstrations, a lot of people very unhappy about it. I was at an event at Harvard Law School in '67. Was it '67? I'm sure it was, where there were a few heads batted in by police. I saw some of that. So this disruption attitude among people wasn't just in the African American community. It was over the Vietnam War as well. And so there was a different attitude going around in the country at the time. A lot of people unhappy. You're asking whether the disturbances that have occurred elsewhere, such as the ones you mentioned were the Rodney King event, and also the Black Lives Matter and Ferguson and so forth. Why hasn't that, or is there something that we did after '67 that caused that not to cause inflammatory actions here in this community? I think that a lot of people in this community were sympathetic with those events, and I would love to say that what we did in terms of New Detroit and other things did that, but I think the credit really goes to the African American leaders that are in our community that speak out very vigorously for what they want and what they believe, and I don't always agree with them, but they certainly they're outspoken, and they've done their best to pursue their cause and the things that they believe that need to be done. But they've also recognize that it's going to be counterproductive to do major destruction of the community, and that will not be helpful to achieving their cause or to helping their people. And they're worried more about their people correctly than creating violence to try to solve the problems. And they recognize that violence won't solve the problems. So I think it's really a tribute to the African American leadership. Perhaps it's due to that they have a better channels of communication as a result of the civic leaders and the business leaders in this community. I hope that's the case, that they recognize that those people have the same goals and objectives in mind, and not always the same methods, but a lot of times the same methods. And so perhaps that's part of it, but I don't really know. You're asking whether looking into the riot now can help us in terms of dealing with the problems that we have now. I think the first thing that we can look at is realize that riots will not bring beneficial change to a community, that the destruction affects their own people. We see so much that goes on in so many places that just creates so much disruption. The world is just not a safe place in so many places, but I think that we can see that it's important that we improve the opportunity for people, and in my view, and we need to try to create values, and it comes from leaders of the country. And the leaders of a state make a huge difference in how they speak about things and how they encourage people to make a difference in how they live their lives. It's really quite interesting to me. So I think leadership has a huge role going forward of the nation and of the state and of the city and so forth. And I think and the business community and the social community and religious community. So the leaders make a huge difference in terms of improving people's character and making them want to have values in their lives that are important. But one of the critical aspects of our community today is education. And we have utterly failed at providing adequate opportunities for education for the citizens of Detroit. And it's been an effort since Governor Granholm appointed an emergency manager, and now Governor Snyder had an emergency manager, and all it's done is add debt. And we've created and it's all been done with the best of intentions and a desire of those in leadership positions to try to create better opportunity. But we now have a school system that we have buildings that are for 85,000 students, and we have 45,000 students in them. We have 45,000 students in charter schools, and we have another 10 or 20,000 going to schools in the suburbs. And we have to find a way to coordinate the overall activity, which I'm kind of encouraged about, because the Republican Senate has adopted a plan called the Detroit Education Commission, which Mayor Duggan also supports, to make certain that it determines when we open a school and where a school needs to be, because we have schools where there are no students and we have too many schools where there are students. And so but education is really where it's at, and nobody has the overall solution for that at this point. And it's really one of the main responsibilities. Obviously, we have a responsibility of government to provide safety and protection for families and so forth. But one of the overall responsibilities is education, an opportunity for education, and that's one of the main things going forward that needs to be accomplished. And it has not been accomplished.
Right. And what a challenge.
And it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge. But there is some innovative thought. There are some plans. There are some things that I think are helpful. Not everybody agrees on how to go forward with it, but we can do a better job. And we have not done even a good job of measuring the performance. We all know it's failed, but nobody really has an overall measurement stick at this point.